Good morning and welcome to the Wayne State School of Information Sciences annual Beyond Barriers Conversations on Equity and Information Conference. My name is Amber Harrison. I use they, she pronouns. I'm an academic services officer as well as the inclusion and belonging coordinator for the school. And today I will be your conference host. Once again, that's right, you've got to see this face for a little while. So our conference in its third year, it's coordinated by our school's Inclusive Excellence Committee. That's right, you guys are getting a shout out. So this year's committee membership consists of 2 students, our Inclusion and Belonging Coordinator, Camille Moore, and FLID Secretary, Kayla War, CIS Academic Services Officer, Mike Tukevich, Archives Coordinator and faculty member, Kim Schroeder, and practicum coordinator and part-time faculty member, Jennifer Gustafson. Huge shout out to our GSA, Camille Moore, who put so much of this together. She really took the advertising and made sure that it got to everyone. So I want to make sure that we give her a special shout out. So last year, if you joined us, we took a turn with another timely topic. We looked at artificial intelligence. We examined how AI can be leveraged in libraries to enhance access to information, while also addressing the ethical implications of AI systems that can perpetuate bias, limit access, and marginalize vulnerable communities. This year, with all the chaos happening in the world around us, the Inclusive Excellence Committee unanimously agreed that this time we should focus on centering social justice in LIS. This theme positions libraries, archives, information centers, and cultural heritage institutions not just as information hubs, but as active partners in strengthening interactive partnership and participation, uplifting marginalized perspectives, and supporting community well-being. We will explore how community-led services, designed in collaboration with those they aim to serve, can cultivate trust, relevance, and shared ownership. From grassroots organizing and mutual aid networks to inclusive outreach, policy advocacy, and culturally grounded programming, we will consider how LIS work can extend beyond the walls of information institutions to meet people where they are. Today's conference will also encourage critical reflection on the responsibilities of information professionals in addressing systemic inequities. What does it mean to practice library and information science through a social justice lens? How can both emerging and veteran LIS practitioners leverage their skills to amplify community stories, expand equitable access, and dismantle barriers within information systems? So, through dialogue, creativity, and collective visioning, this conference empowers both the current and next generation of LIS leaders to reimagine information organizations as catalysts for civic empowerment, social transformation, and community resilience. And so with that, now we'll take a look at the schedule, our roster of events for the day. So today's event will feature an opening keynote by Dr. Travis Wagner. We have a roster of student presentations, followed by an expert panel that will delve into the social justice work in the LIS professions, and then finally a closing keynote by Mara Powell. And about halfway through, we will take a 5-minute break from about 12:05 to 12:10. And so now we'll just look at a couple of reminders and then we'll finally get started. So, while we encourage participation during today's event, please make sure your microphones are muted while our speakers are presenting. We want to give them our undivided attention and respect as they share their critical work with us today. Second, down the line, at the end of each session, attendees are invited to share their questions in the chat for speakers to answer. To help out, our Inclusive Excellence Committee will be monitoring the chat for questions as well as for any troubleshooting assistance that may be needed. And finally, in addition to being kind and respectful to our speakers, please be kind and respectful to each other and to yourselves. We recognize that with everything that's happening in the world right now, that tensions may be high. And though these feelings are valid, we need to make sure that we create spaces where people not only feel safe, but feel brave to speak, question, explore, and understand. And so without further ado, let's begin our opening keynotes with our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Travis Wagner. Dr. Travis Wagner is an assistant professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Their research interests include critical information studies, queer archives, and LGBTQIA plus advocacy in sociotechnical systems. Their work investigates how LGBTQIA plus communities create identity in opposition to sociotechnical systems that characterize and limit those identities. Multiple projects within the classroom and with community organizations have led Wagner to exploring and publishing the unique relationships between obsolete archival mediums and queer counter-historical work across archival contexts. Wagner earned their degree, their PhD in information science from the University of South Carolina and served as a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Archival Futures and the Recovery and Reuse of Archival Data Lab within UMD's College of Information. They are also the co-creator of the Queer Cola Oral History and Digital Archive. So welcome, Dr. Wagner. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'll go ahead and share my slides to start with. Actually, one second. I realize I kept them in presenter mode. Now I have to close them out. Let's
Take your
try it.
time.
Yeah, yeah. Um, going to do the obligatory check to see that we can see those slides. Yeah, great. Okay, cool. So first off, I want to thank Wayne State University so much for having me join as a keynote for this event. I think it's really incredible that you all are doing this, and particularly Amber, I want to thank you for your time in helping facilitate and organize this. I also want to give a shout out to Dr. Shannon Altman, who it was mentioned is here in Scotland. I'm also zooming in from Scotland as well at the same conference as Dr. Altman. So if you hear weird banging noises, it's likely somebody moving through the hotel, or if I have spotty Wi-Fi, I apologize in advance, but I'm really keen and eager to talk to you today. And I'm going to talk to you about an idea I've been working through in the context of trans information work, but sort of thinking through the bigger concept of what socially just information looks like for what I want to capaciously call trying times. There's a bit more contact information for me. Feel free to reach out during or after the presentation if you have any questions. Um, but what I really want to do specifically today is reflect on everyday examples of information work that we might do for social justice and contextualize that socially just information work in this historic moment. Um, and I want to do so by highlighting examples of information work that prioritize historically marginalized communities and emphasize their embodied and lived experiences. I'm going to zoom into the particular sort of group that I am part of and that I do research on behalf, but I want to invite us to sort of draw parallels or connections where it makes sense, particularly across the broader themes that are being explored. And I'm going to do this by first thinking through this process in the contemporary and then looking at historic examples that inform what I do in my work. And with the time we have left, I hope we can discuss the sort of question of who's responsible for this work. So to do that, I want to start with a experience that might be familiar to folks in attendance here. I was sitting at home and received a Facebook message from somebody who's a friend that I haven't talked to in years. And ostensibly, they had a question of me that they wanted to avoid groupthink about the debate regarding trans youth in sports, ostensibly wanting to get my opinion on an issue that they were experiencing. And there are a lot of reasons that I think about why this would happen. We've already been well past what is sort of defined as the transgender tipping point by Time Magazine in roughly 2016, where there's a sort of argument that we're pushing towards trans rights as the new moment and need for society. But it also comes at a time when there's an increased push towards challenging and questioning those rights. A lot of anti-trans activist organizations have emerged that sort of question who has the right to be trans and at what age that happens. So what this person reached out to me and asked was for me to, quote, please address the objection about trans women playing in sports or trans men playing in sports. And I thought about, why was I asked to do this information work, or why was I seen as the individual who might need to address this question? The likelihood is that this is something that the person, he's an older individual, like thought of or is encountering in the spaces he goes through. Perhaps he was at a softball game with a granddaughter or one of his children, and this came up in debate, right? Sort of located in a real moment in a real time. It could be because of other organizations. I mentioned one earlier, but there's an increasing sort of push towards, again, anti-trans charities and activism that are trying to challenge this, right? So it could have come from this desire to better understand why this is happening. It could have also been an attempt to rationalize through medical discourse what it means to be trans or how we sort of understand that. I see this as a part of the equation as well. And this push towards what Evan Viepen calls transnormativity, this expectation that an individual's transition moves between a binary of male and female and that it looks a particular way. He might have been seeking out a way to explain that in those contexts. And I really want to sort of push against that as being a sort of single way of thinking about trans identity, but it was certainly a possibility of this. It's also likely that I had something to do with this as a scholar who's working in this field and increasingly navigating between both the sort of academic work I do, but sort of the public uptake of that. There's a possibility that he's seeing my work and seeing me as somebody who has knowledge about these topics. I'll come back to this in a moment. But it is also very likely that I am a person who's sort of explicitly disclosing and talking about my own queer and trans identities in these processes, and that I have a potential positionality is helping talk through this process as well. Now, I give all of those examples, and ostensibly, when I tried to address the objections of this person, all it led to was additional demands that I address other objections. In that moment, I was like, well, maybe I should just delete this message and just get off of social media because it doesn't seem like it's worth my time to do this work. But it did make me think more about why I might have been or who might be a trusted resource in trans information work. And this is the question that I want to take through the rest of my presentation and ask who is a trusted resource in socially just information work? And again, I am really eager to talk about this as a group at the end. And I think what I also want to think about is when am I truly being asked for an opinion, and when is this work where I am expected to provide and facilitate information about this topic? And I think this is a particular question that is challenging in a moment that is hyper mediated and facing a ton of information overload. This is from a Scientific American article about the sort of mass engagement with dis and misinformation. And you can sort of see some identifiable figures here, but we sort of have this brain of an individual that doesn't have a specific thing in which this information is directing itself towards. Now, if we take something like the discussion of trans identity, we have ecosystems in which all of this misinformation, all of this information, media opinions are circulating. Knowing what is worth listening to, what is worth taking seriously, could be a way to think why this person reached out to me. We could take another topic, something like immigration, raise questions about how that economy of information is playing out. We can also think about it in the technologies that are emerging to sort of facilitate this process, right? The same ecosystems that are informing this debate are also building new ways of sharing, creating, and troubling information as well. So again, there are these elements of this that are about mis, dis, and malinformation. And in particular, I have to imagine that part of what socially just or trans information work is doing is particularly dealing with malinformation. Mis and dis have troubling undercurrents, but the attempt to actively negate the existence of a person through information is a thing that I think we really have to think about the work and labor we're doing. And again, I mention this because when you look at other issues that are occurring, we start to see phobic ideologies, exclusionary ideologies undergirding them. This was the case in the discussion of Alex Preddy following his murder, about debates on whether or not he was trans, right? This idea of sort of sneaking these things into there as a secondary way of delegitimizing a person. And I find those things troubling and want to sort of think through that process. But I also want to be keenly aware that this is a ongoing tension that uniquely faces trans folks, particularly trans women of color, in the active violence done to their bodies. There's an incredible book by Gail Salomon called The Life and Death of Letitia King, in which she describes the way that anti-trans sentiments emerge in society and sort of how they legitimize themselves through discourse. But also, there's just quantitative evidence of the dangers impacting LGBTQ plus folks, and again, trans and non-binary folks in particular, as of 2025, we see an increase rather than decrease of violence, according to GLAAD. So I go back to this idea of like what was the person, what groupthink was this individual trying to avoid, particularly in this debate about trans youth and sports. And I have to hope that at some underlying part, this person was asking me, how do I better understand the lived experience of being a trans young person in a hyper-mediated world? Or at least that is a part of what is going on here. Now, in a sort of perfect world, we would think about a way to learn that information, right? We would go historically to the reference desk at a library. That's a site in which you can actively gather, obtain, evaluate information, usually with a trusted information professional. This is what many of us are in this room, the Zoom room today, to always do and always commit to. But that's one site in which information occurs. We are indebted to Savalanen's idea here of everyday information practices, the idea that we create, seek, share, and use information across a multitude of everyday settings, not just when we need to go get information at a library for whatever sort of codified research process we might think. And again, this is important because we encounter opinions and information in sort of overlapping ways at, say, a youth sports game where a trans youth might be playing, could be a place where that information becomes contested, circulated, and created or shared. So I want to be more explicit about the idea that everyday information practices for some groups of people are about the labor of information work as well. And this is what I want to spend some time working through, both in how it functions in and outside of libraries and what we can learn from those sort of overlapping and divergent functions. And to do this, I want to talk through work that I've done with collaborators, some of which I've seen pop into the room. So it's really wonderful that you all are here, um, to think about the information, the technologies that allow trans and queer folks to exist, and how we might facilitate that as information professionals. So, one thing that I think is important to know, this is from research that I did with Dr. Vanessa Kitsy at the University of South Carolina, that trans, non-binary folks and LGBTQ folks more broadly are quite good and efficient at using technologies to protect themselves and their communities. If it comes to sharing provider information, particularly providers who are trans affirming, they do this at a communal level. They will create spreadsheets and information that circulate between one another because that's the only way they can trust that the folks represented are safe and indeed affirming. But it's also fascinating in other places, right? There's also the use of technologies to create and imagine and counter anti-trans experiences. So I'm in Scotland thinking a lot about J.K. Rowling right now. Unfortunately, fiercely transphobic, but tons of trans folks have a positive and meaningful relationship to something like Harry Potter. So scholars like Diana Flogel have written about how spaces like fan fiction allow people to imagine and create worlds for queerness that otherwise don't exist. So here we see quite literally somebody creating a version of Harry Potter where he is pro-trans, the simplicity of the story being that Harry Potter says trans rights. So this is part of that process as well that I want to highlight. And I also want to highlight that I'm certainly not the only person thinking about this, nor is it a singular question of trans identity. This work is always intersectional. So Chris Wiley, who is a PhD student at the University of Illinois and a librarian there, and I believe I saw Chris pop into the room for this as well, is thinking about these particular contexts for Black trans men. So I want to give Chris a shout out. But I also have collaborators like Valerie Vera who are thinking about the sort of everyday information circulation and sharing of folks who explore non-suicidal self-injury and use tools like TikTok to circumvent content moderation that might over sort of regulate and over censor out of mandatory reporting reasons that are actually detrimental to that community. I'm also indebted to the work of Oliver Hameson, who has been looking at the way that technologies by and for trans people create and address particularly unique needs for trans people. This is a graph from his recent book, Trans Technologies, in which he talks about what a trans technology is, both practically and theoretically, and what its design process is related to. You can see things here, like practically it addresses trans people's needs and challenges, but theoretically it adapts and reconfigures existing technology for trans purposes. I think I showed you examples of that both in my research and others, but it's also this design process related to but centering trans people and created by and for trans people. I want to extend that and sort of be in conversation with Hameson and argue that this is also what trans information is and does. It has to match these flows as well. And this is particularly true because technologies themselves are anti-trans. If we think about profile moderation tools on platforms like Facebook, they require real name policies. We sort of saw the detriment of this as drag performers were told that they could not have these personas because they weren't real individuals. The trouble there is that the same tools for regulation that were being used on drag were also being used for trans people who were using non-government sanctioned names on these platforms. So this sort of intersection between policies and technologies becomes really troubling. And it's, of course, part of a bigger concern for how gender moves through any sociotechnical system, and the sort of question of why gender undergirds these in the first place. I think many in the room will be familiar with the way that body scanners rely on a gender binary, therefore making it difficult for anyone who is outside of that binary in any capacity to move through these without being subject to surveillance and regulation. Um, but again, we can go back to the library and say, well, isn't the library different, right? It's certainly not a technology or an infrastructure where these things would happen. And unfortunately, historically, that isn't exactly the case. And indeed, as Shannon Mattern has written, libraries are infrastructures with technological designs, organizational practices that represent how a person moves through that space. Um, Many of you in this presentation have probably read or heard of Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr's sorting things out, we classify, we organize, we describe things in libraries, and that sort of reflects who is seen as part of a library in the process. Yep, libraries are also places for imagination creation. As Radford et al. Point out, libraries are heterotopias where you can go see and sort of explore other worlds in that space. So it's simultaneously a place that regulates the possibility of identity while opening it up to seeing oneself in a variety of ways. And we see this in a multitude of ways. For folks who've read Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, she has these really incredible couple of pages where she talks about learning about her sexuality in the sort of stacks of a library and being able to sort of find a way to talk about herself by the terms used in a library. And of course, the rise of linked data vocabulary like the Homosaurus, which are implementing LGBTQ plus inclusive taxonomies into libraries have allowed for that representational shift to happen for a variety of people. Yet, that is not a sort of reflection of every LGBTQ identity. And indeed, when it comes to trans identities, as I've sort of written about and many other folks have, there still exist tensions between what is imagined as the needed support by a library for trans people and also what that support looks like because of infrastructure. So in the wake of the first Trump administration, there was a lot of discussion about how to sort of make spaces more inclusive for trans folks. And discussions about inclusive bathrooms were one very viable and justifiable option. But as is sort of apparent in that, is that there are other sort of gendering practices that a library database might do. There are shelving choices that happen that could still alienate or exclude trans people. And Kehia Adolfo and Stephen Kruger have also sort of written about this idea of needing to desystify trans um, and gender diverse inclusion in library work by particularly furthering these points about how locating trans books in library shelves next to deviants or undervaluing trans identity in the hiring portions of librarianship exclude in other ways as well, right? So it is more than simply changing one facet of the lived experiences of trans people in libraries to thinking more broadly about libraries and information spaces as rooted on potentially trans exclusionary practices. Um, and this continues to be a push and pull process. Some of the folks I've mentioned to you already have looked at best practices for queer metadata as a way to more broadly think about representation of identity in libraries. You'll see here also thinking about archives and museums in this space as well. And it goes back to the reference desk being a site of informational interaction in libraries rather than this process that is without human components to it. And that's something I want us to think a bit more about as I move to the sort of next portion of this presentation. And that's because what you learn as you sort of delve into questions of representation in libraries, questions of how to confront inequity, you learn a lot of it is still about this reference interaction. So Emily Drabinski talks about this idea of teaching the radical catalog, where she finds important value in having a dialogue with people about why a system might fail a person, and in doing so, learn about the system's shortcomings while also still finding utility and value in the library itself. The example I always give here is when I was a PhD student, I was teaching gender studies classes at South Carolina, and I'd have lots of like trans students who would want to find books in the library about trans identity, but they put in contemporary terms to search and find those materials, and they would get zero results. The reality was that those materials were named with an outdated term that the person had been taught not to use and therefore could not find those materials. So we'd have this conversation. I was like, well, you have to use this outdated term, but when you do, look at what it opens up, right? So they were able to find this information while learning the limitations of organization to represent those identities. The really cool thing about that, and then perhaps as part of this trans information work, is that student, along with some other trans students, created a sort of secondary spreadsheet that allowed them to be like, oh, well, here's the terms we'd use, but here's where this book is located in the library. And I think that's part of both what Drabinski is trying to get at, but what work by folks like Bree Watson, the Trans Metadata Collective, are also trying to think about is like maybe the sort of solutions are that we create our own tools for description and representation, have them ready, and then allow these institutions to adopt our processes rather than trying to convince these institutions that we can change their processes. And I think of this as a form of what Kate McKinney calls information activism. Kate McKinney is a media studies scholar who has really advocated for thinking about how we get historical objects, how we get representation in queer history by pointing out all the labor that often goes unrecognized in the visibility of a digitized document and what goes onto a bookshelf. And I think trans information work and socially just information work is also a sort of extension of information activism because it is the work that we do that doesn't get codified or quantified in the ways that we might expect it to. And we'll again come back to that idea. Um, but it's also about the sort of practical questions of how we support trans people in libraries. Again, indebted to Stephen Kruger here. He says that the more people who participate in gender inclusion work, the easier it becomes for the people doing it as well as those affected by it. So I'm going to take their definition and sort of argue that the more people participating in socially just information work, the easier it becomes for the people impacted by unjust information. And another way of saying this, it's a sort of quantitative numbers game you have to combat through abundance and challenging that. Um, but again, understanding socially just information work then require us to understand those everyday and particularly here embodied information practices that allow that information to circulate and to exist. So I'm going to call back to work that I did with Dr. Kitsy as a PhD student, where we looked at the health information practices again of LGBTQIA plus folks. And what we sort of found is that based on the context in which they were sort of engaging with information, they would often create and share information either to respond to a risk or a barrier. And those sort of responses led to community protective or community and self-defensive information practices. So protective was sort of a way that you would anticipate a thing that might happen, and you create and share information in anticipation of that. Whereas barriers were an already existing challenge that you also put up defenses and corrections towards. So in my work currently, I'm doing a lot more with archives and particularly queer archival description. And what we're seeing is if we think of queer archivists, whether they identify as queer or are simply working with queer materials, are doing a form of this sort of protective communal information work by gathering materials that are actively being removed from data sets, often beyond the sort of scope of their job, because this has to be volunteer work. But as names are being removed from websites, gathering evidence that those were there is part of this work. But it's also part of the work of describing queer archives more generally. So in the same interview data set from queer archivists or archivists working with LGBTQ plus materials, myself, my doctoral student Evan Allgood, and a MSLS student at Illinois, Mateo Caballero, sort of talked to archivists about the choices they make and what they put into an archival record and what external reasons influence that choice. And commonly, there was a discussion about I won't put into a record an identity that doesn't exist in those materials. I wouldn't want to mislead somebody to try to find materials that aren't there. There were also concerns about how searchable or findable these materials were. So choosing particularly general terms as a means to ensure that it can't be controlled and found and removed as part of this process. And also, there is a larger, an equally important looming factor of like the extractive tools of AI models coming in and trying to find this language and repurpose it for training data. So there's multiple factors of combating that. And I give this example because finding aids, particularly finding aids for LGBTQ plus materials, are often seen as poorly representative of those collections. And what we learned from these interviews of almost 30 archivists is that almost every descriptive choice in these records was deeply reflective and often made under incredible duress. So the thing you're seeing here is actually quite thoughtfully represented. And just to give you an example, this is a archive from Wayne State University, and in it you sort of might ask, well, like what parts of queer identity are mentioned here? And it could be just general enough that this choice is made. So I imagine this is representative of thoughtful care. And again, sort of like protective information work being done by archivists. But of course, Vanessa and myself, our collaborators, aren't the only ones who've ever thought about this, nor are we the only ones sort of thinking about representational tensions in queer information practices. Megan Threats at the University of Michigan has been sort of using this lens to think about the information practices of Black sexual minority men, particularly in the context of HIV and AIDS information. And she sort of expanded this idea from protective information practices to also think about promotive information practices. Threats' work is both incredibly intersectional, as you can sort of see here, understanding that there's system structures and institutions all at play and who is informing how we access information. And what is really incredible about her work is like her argument that in spite of that, there's really resilient and abundant information practices happening. This idea that people might still promote and create information despite this sort of perceived stigma or discrimination. And I think this is a thing that I find it sort of parallels and echoes a lot with what we know historically about trans information work, particularly the role of a common tool for a lot of social justice work, and that is the zine. Folks who transition many times will make some sort of zine about their transition experience. This is a deeply personal, embodied, and individual experience. But you'll read these zines and they'll sort of say, I'm writing this zine because I want you to know that this is a thing you can get through. This is a thing that has processes. It can be done. So it serves this promotive function by merely documenting and making evident that this is possible. I would say that is trans information work, and particularly a sort of creative, accessible process as a result. And I want to go back to fan fiction because I do think these ideas of speculating and imagining into existence transness is also part of this promotive work. The idea that you can name and make identity available is part of this as well. And it's here that I want to turn to historical documents that I use in my work to think about how we can widen the history of trans information work. I've been spending a lot of time looking at Crosstalk magazine, which was a trans information magazine from like the late 1980s to the sort of early 2000s that would have been distributed to people who were part of the broader trans community. They use a lot of other terms to describe themselves at the time that might be historically dated, but the idea was this is a growing group of people who need to know information about one another. This is from the 61st issue of the newsletter, in which on this page to the left, you see great moments in TV history in which one of the creators has taken moments when characters ostensibly dressed in drag and sort of said, well, these of course aren't actual trans representations, but they give us evidence of trans aesthetics and possibilities, right? So this newsletter would gather these materials and say, we want to reclaim them as a possible trans history through this like great moments in TV sort of um, encapsulation. To the right, we have comics created by trans folks that are exploring the information needs of trans people, particularly trans women. And what I find incredible about these is like they've already taken as possible their existence, right? So these are all about information practices where it's like, oh, do I need a mammogram as a trans woman? It's a little tongue in cheek, but of course, what the idea is like my stepping into this space isn't questioned as being a woman, but perhaps that my health information needs could be different, right? And I do really love the hopefulness of this particular set of materials. And it leads me to think about then what role librarians have in facilitating this work. So perhaps an unsurprising suggestion from me would be inviting creation in spaces through something like zine making workshops. Sometimes the work of information professionals is to facilitate the information work of their communities. So here, having a zine making fest that is focused on trans folks could be an explicit way to do that. And I would say it's an explicit way to be more socially just and to do social justice work more generally. I also want to remember that sometimes trans historical objects become uh, accidentally trans, even though their creation was intentional. So I don't know if we have any indie gamers in the room, but if you do, you probably recognize this as an image from Celeste, which is an incredible platform game, where as it came out, people playing it were like, this seems a lot like it might be talking about the experience of being trans. And what was later revealed was that the creator was actually herself a trans woman and was also using the game to explore that identity. So, part of facilitating trans information work in libraries and archives is to sort of share and circulate these things that are implicitly trans, but then invite explicit trans remediation and reuse. And to that point, I want to sort of draw your attention to the work of the Trans Game Zine, which is trans information work through the creative game process. So, it's a set of video games designed by trans game creators that are focused on broader queer issues. A particular favorite of mine is a screen grab here from a game called You Don't Have to Go Home, but You Can't Stay Here, which is about an individual who is moving through. You play as a character who's moving through the last night of a queer bar that's about to close. I find it to be a very sort of sweet, if sad game, but truly incredible. But I, of course, am giving you hypothetical examples, and I started with this idea of questioning what happens when you as an individual are asked to do that information work? What does that labor look like, and who do you owe that labor to? And what I want to say here is that socially just or social justice information work is hopeful, speculative, and often unintentional. So, the Crosstalk newsletter that I mentioned to you earlier is a copy from my personal collection that I've been building as part of a book project that I'm working on, but also as part of gathering my own personal trans archival collection. It's well documented through things like the Digital Transgender Archive, but I thought it was important for me to have a material copy to reference in both research and teaching. I bought it off eBay, like many people buy their sort of archival materials. And in that copy, I was flipping through it and found in the very back of it a set of printed out messages from a BBS or a bulletin board system that would have been messages between people in an early version of like, think of like Reddit or a forum where you communicate with other people. These were two messages that were printed out from like 1991. I want to say late December 1991. I've removed the contact information because these are things that aren't in an archive and not necessarily something that the person knew they put in here. But ostensibly, it was part of a health information BBS, and the title of that post was gender issues. So the two printed out messages are communication between an individual and then two other members of this BBS. So they're responding to the individual who I believe is asking a question about how do I convince my mom that it's all right that I'm trans and that it's not something that goes against God or it's something that is illogical. And it's these two discussions by other members in which they explain, well, here's one thing you might say. Here's how you might think about what you're doing and justify that this is valuable. And I particularly find it because they're like, oh, you're being told that this is not a birth defect or this is something wrong. And if that's the argument that you're going to use, perhaps you remind folks that like technological advancement's part of what we have to think about here. So if this is a thing that we weren't meant to do, then we also weren't meant to fly or drive cars, yet we do those technologies. So this response is speculative and hopeful, but also makes an argument that trans technologies are just a logical extension of other evolution. So the ability to be trans and to transition are just rights that we should embrace. So I would see this as a set of protective and also promotive information practices, to go back to what I said earlier, that are happening in two surprise archival documents that I found in the back of a copy of a newsletter from 30 years ago. But What is also really fascinating in these sort of messages is they also remind the person what they don't have to do or what won't be useful trans information work for them. So the person's also asking about sort of biblical justifications for gender. And the folks are like, listen, we've gone through every page of this. We didn't find anything. Don't do this. You should focus your resources elsewhere, right? So this idea of also protective labor as well. And I find these two just accidental materials incredibly indicative of the long tail of trans information work that has existed in front of us and will hopefully exist into the future. So, what this led me to remember is that like, I, as somebody who is sort of a professor who studies these materials, who invests in trans information work, also has to relearn what it means to do that work and to see that that work has been going on. So I think for every time that we learn social justice or social just information work, we also have to relearn that, right? So it's an iterative process that takes time to adapt to and adjust to. But sometimes socially just information work often exists only in communal circulation. So if we go to an institution to find that work, it might not be explicit or visible to us because it might not be there yet, or it might not be designed to be in those spaces. And the evidence of socially just information work is often accidental and ephemeral in nature as well, in that it wasn't designed to be visible or quantitative. It was sometimes just designed between two individuals to sort of express a point. And I would be remiss not to say that socially just information work is exhausting. I mentioned the story to you at the onset, and you can get the sense from the communication from those two newsletter printouts, or sorry, those two message board printouts that this work was trying for the individual asking it. But it leads me to call upon two key queer theorists and trans studies scholars as I close up this talk. The first one being Jose Esteban Munoz, who wrote Cruising Utopia, the then and there Queer Futurity, and Hill Malatino's Trans Care. I bring in Munoz's work because in this book, he talks about the queer archive as inherently being ephemeral. It's designed and built through things that we accidentally find in archives or things that weren't meant to be there, but remind us of that work. The two printed out message board posts were ephemeral and doubly accidental because, again, they weren't a thing I discovered in a traditional archive, but a thing I discovered in trying to build my own archive of evidence, right? So these things circulate across time as well. But in Malentino's particular case, I want to pull one of his quotes and then rework it into coherent sentence. You can see here all of my syntactical changes to make this work as a sentence for you. But what I want to say here is that trans care and here socially just information work is alienating insofar as one doesn't own what they produce and ultimately rely on someone else to determine its value and worth. That might sound negative, but I want to sort of reframe it and actually echo Malentino's argument that we oftentimes think about the work we do. And when I thought about the work I did to explain away transphobia to an individual, I was like, who am I doing this for? And who do I owe this to? And the examples I gave you earlier of these were probably doing the same thing. They asked, who do I owe this to? And and like, why am I doing this? And in this moment, it was for me to then justify my own work into the future. And I want to sort of conclude there by reminding us that we don't know how our work and our socially just information work will show up in the future, but doing it will matter to somebody down the road, even if we never know that it matters to them. So I'll stop there. I'm really excited to talk to you all. Thank you so much for letting me talk, and I'm really excited to answer a few questions.
Thank you so much for getting us started this morning. I have to selfishly say I studied gender and sexuality, so I especially found a lot of what you discuss, especially some of the archival pieces you showed us to be fascinating. So thank
Great.
you. Does anyone have questions or anything they'd like to share? Please feel free to share in the chat. we've got some time. So if you're feeling shy or worried about that, do not worry. We've got a little time for some questions. Oh, hi, Kai. Yes.
Hi. Um, First off, Dr. Wagner, thank you so much for your presentation and for giving us insight. Um, and I I'm really bonding with um what you said at the end about not understanding that our work is important even in the times that we won't see it. Like that is something that my pastor says a lot. Um, and I and I'm really I guess my question is, as somebody who is cishet, is like navigating being or trying to be informed and um working in these spaces with my students, with patrons at the library, with even within my own family, like what, how can people who are accessing all of these privileges make amplify this work? Like what, in what ways do we purposefully seek out opportunities and ways to make this work visible and more amplified without um, being a hijacker of the conversation?
Okay, that's an incredible question. Thank you so much for it. And thank you for asking it and framing it in such a thoughtful way, right? Because there's always that like model, not that you do this, but I think you've heard of that like sort of approach that we think about. That's like the deficit model thinking where it's like, oh, you don't have this thing, and I need to give it to you because you don't know any better, right? And of course, that is often not the case, as I tried to sort of highlight here. Trans folks know what they're doing and they're sort of sharing that information. So I sometimes just sort of think that the question isn't even like, do I need to amplify it? But instead sort of offering your sort of self as a resource for whatever they want or think, right? So if there's any community event that's public that trans folks are circulating. Pride events are a common space for this, where it's like if I bring my institution, if it's the public library, for example, right? If I merely have a table there that just reminds us we're here, there's the things we have, often you will learn from the community what they might want there, right? And so the implication is like, how do you see how do you see us as helping amplify things for you, right? So they might be like, oh, well, we have these resources. We'd love for you to put them somewhere on your library website, right? And maybe that's a solution, right? Rather than being like, I need to amplify you. So maybe in that way, it's like a slight inversion that you just again remind folks that they're there, and then when they want to come be amplified, they'll do that process, right? Does that help?
No, that is extremely helpful, and um, no, thank you.
Cool.
I sorry because I know you have some other questions, but like, what are some ways in which we can also um not just compensate but support without basically allowing you all to do free labor?
Okay, yeah, this is a great question. I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of like information audits in your institutions, right? Sometimes you don't need the community to reflectively look at what's already wrong and needs to be changed. And this is where I'm particularly happy for the advances that have happened in the past 10 years. I alluded to things like the Homosaurus and the Transmetadata Collective. Those were both small, tiny projects a decade ago. They are now well sustained. Like the Homosaurus was a group of people working together, but now they have multiple editorial and implementation boards that help enact that. And they also have guides on how you might yourself as a practitioner incorporate more inclusive language into your metadata record. So you could take those tools that have been created and use those as a starting point. That way, when a person comes to a library, comes to an archive, they're not going to have to be like, hey, you're already naming things the wrong way, right? And I find those projects are really a great way to, one, practice internal evaluation, but also honestly practice some like foundational library and information science skills, right? Because you're also remembering how your catalog records work in the process. So maybe that would be a suggestion and something you could do without exhausting the labor of a community.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Um, is it helpful for me to just read the questions, Amber?
I can read them, you can read them, whichever you are most comfortable with.
I am happy with either. I don't know how much you want to you want to help me.
I'll read them for you.
Yeah,
We've got a
sure.
couple in the chat. Um, oop, uh-oh. And then it disappeared. So we've got another question from Samantha.
Mhm.
Samantha asks, how do you suggest handling patrons who may argue biases from the resources you may provide them?
Um, I'm gonna try. I think um, I'm trying to understand the question. Handling bias in what sense, Samantha? Which I realize you typed the question, so it'll require you to then retype an answer.
Samantha, if you're able to come off mute and share, you're more than welcome to do that as well.
Sure.
Oh,
So I'm just thinking, for instance,
Mhm.
if you provide something from the New York Times, they may say, "Oh, that's liberal media,"
Mm,
mm,
that kind of thing. But that could
yeah.
even extend to academic scholarly work. If they're coming from the NIH or something like that,
Mhm.
they could say, "Oh, that's liberal," and just dismiss
Mhm.
it.
Yeah, so yeah, that's like a larger intellectual freedom, like censorship question, right? And I know I know Dr. Altman's here, so I don't want to like step on the toes of the true experts on this topic, right? But you know, that is a felt sentiment, and you can choose to the degree to which you want to combat that. But I mean, you can also make the argument as an information professional that you're like, well, you can think this is biased. This is still information that another patron's requested. So I'm making it accessible to them, right? It's all right to not engage with those discussions of bias. And I think that's important work to do as well. I also find when I teach these tensions and I have students sort of raise those concerns, this is where it tends to happen to me the most is like, well, asking them how they think it's biased or like what led them to that is often enough of a discussion to sort of get them to step back. And of course, that is labor and time. But I think if I go back to the slides I had earlier, just that wall of information that a person experiences, that itself is like a discourse where they're just sort of alluding to bias and not really thinking about why they process that, right? And I would just say approaching patrons from even bias is likely coming from a place where they don't have a space to talk about it. And that's why I tried to give the individual I was talking about at the beginning and end of the presentation grace because I was like, I truly don't know why you want to talk to me about this. And I can try to ask you, but I have to hope that it's so you can learn better. Yeah, so I mean, dialogue's not the easiest option, but it might be the solution here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
and next, we do in fact have a question from our Associate Dean, Shannon Altman. She says, thank you for the great talk. Would you talk a little bit about care?
Mm,
And when she says care, she's referring to caring for ourselves and others while doing socially just information work.
mm. Yeah. I will be candid with you all that sometimes my care work is getting with folks like me and then doing everything but talking about the labor that is involved with this work and like sort of having like we're agreeing that we're taking time away from doing this. It's also fine to not immediately respond to things. I didn't say this in the example I gave you, but that message came in at like the night before, and I was like, I don't need to figure out a response to this thing immediately, right? I was afforded the privilege because again, it wasn't like at a reference desk in the middle of a work day, but stepping away and understanding that this work doesn't always have immediacy is an important thing as well. And I guess the other point I would say, and why I was really sort of empowered and emboldened by discovering truly on accident another example of this work in the past is like it may seem like you're doing it in isolation, but oftentimes many people have done it before you, and many people will do it after you. And I say this as somebody who's now had a few years into this work, certainly not the degree that which many sort of like socially just information professionals and scholars have done for decades, but I can truly see that what was happening a decade ago, even if it seems like we're in a worse moment historically, the advances and the impact are much greater than they were, right? So taking that scale of things is how I take care of myself and others around me.
You. I think we have time for one more question, if we have any takers. All right. Sounds like we've got to them all. All right. Thank you, Travis Wagner.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
thank you. This was
Really
wonderful.
appreciate it. I actually might need to reach out to you about some of those sources. It's great.
Please do. And that's true for you and anyone who is in attendance. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.